Before we begin, I want to ask you a very important favor. Our channel needs subscribers to keep growing and bringing you content about pilots and aviation like this. If you enjoy what we do here, please subscribe now and turn on the notification bell. It helps a lot and makes all the difference. I'm counting on you. Now, let's get into the story.
In the years leading up to World War II, the concept of nighttime aerial combat remained largely unexplored in the United States. While some early theorists in the Army Air Corps pondered the possibilities, the lack of appropriate technology, radar systems and aircraft suited to such missions meant that night operations were minimal and mostly improvised. In Europe, however, the rapid rise of the Luftwaffe and the advent of nighttime bombing campaigns, particularly the destructive German raids over London during the Blitz, revealed a critical vulnerability in air defense systems. Aircraft that, operated under the cover of darkness, could strike strategic targets with little opposition. These developments would catalyze a massive shift in American military aviation, and at the center of that transformation would stand one of the most unique and capable aircraft of the entire war, the Northrop P-61 Black Widow. The origins of the P-61 can be traced back to 1940, when the British Royal Air Force began facing relentless nighttime bombing raids from German bombers. Desperate to find a countermeasure, the RAF began fitting some of their aircraft with the new radar technology, then still in its infancy. It was a crude solution, but it was effective enough to help RAF pilots intercept enemy bombers at night. Word of these developments quickly reached the United States, prompting officials in the Army Air Corps to investigate the potential for an American-made night fighter equipped with onboard radar. At that time, radar was still considered top secret. The concept of mounting it on a high-performance aircraft that could track and destroy enemy planes in complete darkness was as revolutionary as it was ambitious. In early 1940, the U.S. military formed a small technical committee to study the viability of such an aircraft. Out of this effort came specification Project XF-10, which would later evolve into a formal requirement for a twin-engine, two-seat fighter designed explicitly for nighttime interception. Jack Northrop, a visionary aircraft designer and founder of Northrop Aircraft, saw an opportunity. His team was already known for their advanced engineering and willingness to break with convention. When the U.S. Army Air Corps issued a formal request for proposal, RFP, in January 1941, for a dedicated night fighter with airborne radar capabilities, Northrop submitted an audacious design that would break nearly every convention in aviation. At the time, Northrop's concept called for a large twin-boom, twin-engine aircraft with a central fuselage pod housing a crew of 3, a pilot, a radar operator, and a gunner. The aircraft would be powered by 2 Pratt & Whitney R2800 double Wasp radial engines, among the most powerful available, providing the necessary speed and power to chase down enemy bombers. For armament, the Black Widow would carry 4 20 Hispano M2 cannons in the belly and 4 50-caliber Browning machine guns mounted in a remotely operated dorsal turret. This combination of firepower was unmatched in any American fighter at the time, but what truly set the Black Widow apart was its radar. The P-61 would be the first U.S. aircraft specifically designed around the inclusion of airborne radar. The SCR-720 system, developed by Bell Telephone Laboratories and MIT's Radiation Laboratory, the radar gave the P-61 the ability to detect enemy aircraft at ranges up to 5 miles in complete darkness, through clouds, or even in poor weather. For the first time, American pilots would be able to hunt their targets with a level of precision previously unimaginable at night. In March 1941, the Army approved Northrop's proposal. The XP-61 prototype was ordered, and construction began at Northrop's plant in Hawthorne, California, However, building an aircraft as advanced and specialized as the Black Widow proved to be a monumental task. Engineers encountered constant challenges, most notably with integrating the bulky radar system, ensuring structural integrity with the twin-boom design, and fine-tuning the innovative remote-control gun turret. Nonetheless, Northrop's team pressed forward, driven by a shared sense of urgency. America's entry into the war, following the attack on Pearl Harbor, only heightened that urgency. On May 26, 1942, the P-61 made its first flight, piloted by Northrop test pilot Vance Breese. From the outset, the aircraft displayed promising performance. It was stable, powerful, and responsive despite its size. With a wingspan of 66 feet and a length of nearly 50 feet, the Black Widow was the largest U.S. fighter aircraft ever built at the time. But thanks to its twin R-2800 engines, it could reach speeds of over 360 km/h and had a combat range of more than 1,000 miles, enough to pursue enemy aircraft across wide swathes of territory. Flight testing continued throughout late 1942 and early 1943. Though progress was steady, a number of serious problems delayed production. The remote control turret suffered from reliability issues, particularly during high-speed turns and dives. Engineers also struggled with visibility from the cockpit, especially during landings at night. The aircraft's landing gear proved temperamental and required repeated redesigns. These delays meant that despite the aircraft's promise, frontline deployment was still more than a year away. While testing continued, American interest in night fighters surged. The Army Air Forces began pressing Northrop to deliver production aircraft quickly. To meet this demand, Northrop expanded its production lines and began converting early prototypes into near-combat-ready P-61As, the first production variant. Though the dorsal turret was initially omitted due to mechanical issues, the rest of the aircraft systems proved solid. Training programs were established to prepare night fighter crews, many of whom were drawn from traditional fighter and bomber squadrons, and squadrons began forming across the continental U.S. In the background, the air war in Europe and the Pacific was evolving rapidly. Allied forces were encountering Japanese and German aircraft that flew primarily at night, often at altitudes and speeds that made them hard to intercept using standard aircraft. It was clear that the Black Widow would be deployed in both theaters, but its exact role was still being defined. By early 1944, the first P-61A aircraft were shipped to Europe under the newly formed 401st Night Fighter Operational Training Group. Their task was to deploy and operate the P-61 in real combat conditions, providing critical feedback on performance, radar operation, and engagement strategies. Pilots quickly came to appreciate the Black Widow's capabilities. Despite its size, it could turn sharply, accelerate quickly, and absorb significant damage. It was not as nimble as a P-51 Mustang or as fast as a jet, but for its intended role, it was unparalleled. Meanwhile, in the Pacific, the 6th Night Fighter Squadron received its first Black Widows in Hawaii and soon deployed them to Saipan and later Iwo Jima. There, the P-61 began conducting night patrols and intercepting Japanese bombers on nocturnal raids. The radar operators, working closely with ground-based radar stations, would guide their pilots toward enemy aircraft, sometimes vectoring them in from dozens of miles away. Then, in complete darkness, the radar operator would direct the pilot for the final intercept, often culminating in a sudden, blinding burst of cannon fire at close range. While many combat aircraft during World War II were designed and deployed, in rush timelines, often with mixed success, the P-61 stood out for its meticulous design and combat effectiveness. It wasn't just a converted bomber or an adapted day fighter. It was the first aircraft the U.S. had ever built from the ground up, with the explicit purpose of fighting at night, guided by radar and operated by a specialized crew working in perfect coordination As 1944 unfolded, the Black Widow took its place on the front lines of a war being fought around the clock. While daylight saw swarms of fighters and bombers engaging across the skies of Europe and the Pacific, the darkness had long offered a kind of sanctuary to the enemy. It was in this void, between moonlit clouds and radar echoes, that the P-61 Black Widow began its hunt. Though it entered service relatively late in the war, its impact was immediate, especially in roles that no other aircraft could fulfill. As effectively, in Europe, the arrival of the P-61 coincided with the height of the Allied strategic bombing campaign against Nazi Germany. While massive formations of American B-17 flying fortresses and B-24 Liberators attacked German industrial targets by day, the British Royal Air Force continued their nightly bombing raids under cover of darkness. The Luftwaffe, in response, had deployed night fighters of their own, mostly Junkers Ju-88s and Messerschmitt Bf-110s outfitted with radar. The skies above Europe at night were deadly arenas where fighters and bombers played a game of cat and mouse. The 422nd Night Fighter Squadron became the first to take the P-61 into operational combat in the European theatre of operations. Based initially in England, the squadron moved to forward bases in France shortly after D-Day. From there, they conducted nighttime air patrols, tasked with intercepting Luftwaffe intruders, protecting Allied bombers returning late from missions, and ensuring the safety of supply convoys operating under the cover of night. The P-61 quickly earned a reputation among its crews. Nicknamed Black Widow after the venomous spider, the aircraft's sleek black paint, predatory design and deadly weaponry made it a fitting namesake. Pilots and radar operators worked in perfect synchrony with the radar operator tracking enemy aircraft using the SCR-720 radar system and giving precise commands to the pilot during the approach. The pilot would close the distance quietly, positioning the Black Widow just below and behind the unsuspecting target, then fire a devastating burst from the quad 20mm cannons and 50 caliber machine guns. Most enemy bombers never saw it coming. One of the first confirmed aerial victories by a P-61 in Europe came on the night of July 6, 1944. Captain Harold D. Kimmel and his radar operator, Lieutenant Raymond Rutledge of the 422nd Squadron, intercepted a German Focke-Wulf FW-190 attempting a nighttime harassment raid. Using their radar, they closed in silently and fired at close range, shredding the enemy aircraft in mid-air. It was the first of many victories for the squadron, and a moment that cemented the Black Widow's place in the war. Over the coming months, P-61 squadrons in Europe accumulated dozens of kills. Some of the most dramatic missions involved not dogfights, but interdiction strikes, attacking enemy troop movements, convoys and trains under moonlight or cloud cover. The Black Widow's heavy armament made it ideally suited for such missions. Its ability to fly low and deliver massive firepower under night conditions gave it an edge in disrupting German logistics in France, the Low Countries, and eventually across the Rhine. Meanwhile, in the Pacific theater, a very different kind of war was being fought across thousands of miles of ocean, dense jungle islands, and isolated airstrips. Japanese aircraft, particularly Mitsubishi G4M, Betty bombers, and various night raiders, had long operated with impunity after dark. The arrival of the P-61 changed that dynamic almost immediately. The 6th Night Fighter Squadron, operating out of Saipan in the Mariana Islands, became the first to engage enemy aircraft in the Pacific using the Black Widow. Their early missions focused on intercepting Japanese reconnaissance planes and bombers, attempting to disrupt American air bases and supply lines. These missions were often lonely, long flights over dark waters, relying entirely on instruments and radar to locate the enemy. But again and again, the P-61 proved itself. On the night of June 30th, 1944, Lieutenant Dale Haberman and radar operator Lieutenant Raymond Mooney intercepted and destroyed a Japanese Betty bomber attempting a raid on Tinian. It was one of the first kills scored by the Black Widow in the Pacific. More would follow. Crews learned to use the terrain to their advantage, sometimes flying low beneath radar echoes to avoid detection, then popping up at the last moment to strike. On Iwo Jima, P-61s began flying night intruder missions, not only to defend American bases, but to proactively hunt Japanese aircraft and installations. These missions sometimes pushed the Black Widow beyond its design limits, but the aircraft's durability and the professionalism of its crews made a powerful combination. In China and Burma, the 426th Night Fighter Squadron took their P-61s into some of the most remote and difficult environments of the entire war. Tasked with protecting supply routes like the Hump, the perilous airlift over the Himalayas into China, the squadron often operated in near-complete isolation, battling weather as fierce as the enemy. Yet even in these harsh conditions, the Black Widow remained effective. One of the most unique features of the P-61 was its crew dynamic. While many fighters had a single pilot or a two-man configuration, the Black Widow's three-person crew created a collaborative approach to air combat. The radar operator was not just a navigator, but an essential element of the engagement, directing the pilot with cool, calm instructions, even in the heat of battle. The gunner, stationed in the rear turret when equipped, provided defensive fire, and in some cases served as an extra pair of eyes and ears. Crews that trained together bonded deeply, trusting one another with their lives night after night. Despite these successes, the Black Widow's combat record remained relatively modest in terms of total aerial victories. This was due in part to its specialized mission and the timing of its deployment. By the time the P-61 reached widespread operational status, the air superiority battles of the early war had shifted. In many theaters, enemy air activity at night had been significantly reduced, especially by mid to late 1945. Still, the aircraft filled a vital role no other platform could, and when it did engage, it was often with deadly precision. In addition to air-to-air missions, P-61s were increasingly used in ground attack roles. With its heavy cannons and sturdy airframe, the Black Widow was an ideal platform for strafing ground targets, especially during the final months of the war in the Pacific. On Okinawa, P-61s flew dozens of sorties each night, attacking truck convoys, artillery positions, and fuel depots. In many of these missions, radar was used not just to track aircraft, but to guide bombing runs and target areas in poor visibility. The Black Widow's versatility was on full display during one of the most dramatic air battles of the Pacific, over the Philippines. In early 1945, the 550th and 418th Night Fighter Squadrons used their P-61s to provide night coverage during the Luzon campaign. Japanese aircraft launched desperate night attacks against American shipping and airfields, hoping to stall the U.S. advance. The P-61s responded with relentless patrols, often shooting down raiders at close range and thwarting attacks before they reached their targets. One crew, flying a mission near Clark Field, downed 3 enemy aircraft in a single night, an incredible feat given the difficulty of nighttime aerial combat. Back in Europe, the P-61 continued to prove its worth. During the Battle of the Bulge, in late 1944, German forces launched a massive surprise offensive through the Ardennes. Although much of the combat took place in bitter winter weather, with limited visibility, the Black Widows flew nightly patrols to protect Allied rear areas and supply routes. In several cases, they intercepted Luftwaffe aircraft attempting to drop supplies or attack Allied convoys. The ability to maintain air defense, even in total darkness, gave Allied ground forces a critical advantage during the intense fighting. One of the most notable accomplishments of the P-61 came near the very end of the war. On the night of August 14, 1945, just hours before the Japanese surrender was announced, a P-61B from the 548th Night Fighter Squadron, piloted by Lieutenant Robert W. Bob McDonald and radar operator Lieutenant Bruce K. Layton, intercepted and shot down a Japanese Nakajima Ki-43 Oscar. It was the last confirmed aerial victory by a U.S. aircraft in World War II, and fittingly, it was scored by the Black Widow. While the P-61 Black Widow was known for its unique combat role and radar-guided precision, the foundation of its success rested on its daring and innovative design. Unlike any other American fighter before it, the Black Widow's very structure was a direct response to the demands of nighttime combat, radar integration, and heavy firepower. It wasn't merely a plane with radar, it was a plane built around radar. And that distinction came with countless engineering challenges that pushed the limits of 1940s aerospace design. At first glance, the P-61 didn't look like a traditional fighter. Its twin-boom layout, housing engines and extending back to twin vertical tails, was reminiscent of the Lockheed P-38 Lightning, but that's where the similarities ended. At the center of the Black Widow's wingspan sat a bulbous, rounded fuselage nacelle, where the cockpit, radar equipment and crew compartment were located. The size and complexity of this central pod made it one of the most technically demanding airframes ever built by Northrop. The cockpit itself was unique. The pilot sat forward under a heavily glazed canopy that provided excellent visibility during clear skies, but still had limited sightlines directly downward and rearward, which was a problem for night landings. Behind the pilot was the radar operator, whose compartment contained not only the SCR-720 radar scope, but also various communications and navigation systems. Depending on the configuration, a third crew member, a gunner, sat further aft, manning the remote-control dorsal turret when installed. Perhaps the most impressive engineering feat was the integration of the radar. Unlike smaller day fighters, the P-61 had to accommodate a full suite of electronic equipment, antennae, transmitters, receivers, displays and power systems, all within a confined fuselage space. The SCR-720 radar, which replaced the older SCR-520 design, featured a forward-facing dish antenna hidden behind a smooth plastic radome on the aircraft's nose. This radar could detect aircraft at ranges up to 10 miles in ideal conditions, and with elevation and azimuth displays, it provided 360-degree situational awareness. But installing the radar wasn't simply a matter of placing a dish in the nose. The entire airframe had to be insulated and shielded to protect the radar from electrical interference. Additional cooling systems were needed to prevent the sensitive electronics from overheating during extended patrols in tropical or desert environments. Engineers also worked extensively to ensure that the heavy radar and crew configuration didn't compromise the aircraft's center of gravity or flight characteristics. Powering the Black Widow were two Pratt & Whitney R2800-65 double Wasp radial engines, each delivering 2,000 horsepower. These engines were among the most powerful radial engines of World War II and had already proven their worth in aircraft like the F-4U Corsair and the P-47 Thunderbolt. But on the P-61, they had to haul a much heavier airframe, nearly 30,000 pounds fully loaded, over long distances, often at night, with full radar and gun systems operating. To support long patrols and heavy combat loads, the aircraft was fitted with large fuel tanks, reinforced wings, and powerful hydraulics. Its wingspan, 66 feet, was greater than that of a B-25 Mitchell bomber, and its four-bladed propellers were nearly 13 feet in diameter. Takeoffs and landings were no small feat, especially on poorly lit or primitive airstrips in forward combat zones. Pilots were specially trained to handle night operations with limited visibility, and to work closely with ground crews for instrument approaches. The Black Widow's armament was another signature element of its design, the four 20mm Hispano M2 cannons mounted in the belly gave it unmatched punch. These cannons could fire up to 700 rounds per minute each, tearing through enemy aircraft with ease. The 50 caliber machine guns in the dorsal turret, when installed, offered flexibility in both offense and defense. The turret itself was an engineering marvel, electrically operated and controlled remotely by a gunner using a periscope-style sighting system. Originally, the turret was designed to pivot automatically toward the greatest threat based on inputs from the radar and fire control system. But in practice, mechanical issues plagued early models. The turret would sometimes lock or track inaccurately at high speed. For this reason, many P-61A models were delivered without the turret until improvements were made in the later B and C variants. Still, when functioning properly, the turret gave the Black Widow 360-degree defensive coverage, an advantage few fighters could match. Another unique feature of the P-61 was its landing gear. Because of the aircraft's height, weight, and central nacelle configuration, the landing gear system had to be overbuilt for durability. The nose wheel retracted backward into the central pod, while the main gear extended outward and then swiveled forward into the engine nacelles. Maintenance crews had to be specially trained to service the gear mechanisms, as the hydraulic and mechanical complexity far exceeded that of standard fighters. Flight testing revealed both strengths and weaknesses. The Black Widow was generally stable in flight and performed well in turns. Considering its size, pilots noted that it could handle tight climbs and dives, especially when chasing slower bombers or ground targets. However, it wasn't particularly agile in a dogfight, and its climb rate lagged behind smaller fighters like the P-51 or P-38. That wasn't a problem, though. Its mission was to engage large aircraft or sneak up on fighters using stealth and surprise. One of the most difficult aspects of flying the P-61 was managing the workload during night missions. Pilots had to rely on their radar operators almost entirely when flying lights-out missions in complete darkness. Crews developed specialized communication protocols, using short, crisp commands to guide intercepts. A typical engagement might begin with ground radar alerting the crew to enemy activity 50 miles away. The P-61 would climb to altitude. The radar operator would scan the scope for blips, and once contact was made, would begin giving vector headings, closing speeds, and range estimates. The final approach was often the most intense moment. Flying. Blind at 200 MEPs in total darkness, the pilot would listen to the operator's voice. 2 o'clock low, 3,000 feet. Steady. Closing. Fire! In seconds, the night would erupt in cannon fire, and the sky would light up with traces and explosions. Then, just as quickly, the P-61 would vanish into the dark again. Despite its size, the Black Widow became a favorite among its crews. It was tough, dependable, and surprisingly comfortable for long missions. The large cockpit gave room for movement, and with 3 crew members, the human element helped reduce fatigue and stress. The sense of camaraderie inside a P-61 was unlike that of a single-seat fighter. Pilots and radar operators formed tight partnerships, and many attributed their survival to the trust and professionalism of their teammates. As the war progressed, Northrop continued refining the aircraft. The P-61B introduced improvements like a longer nose for better radar performance, redesigned gunners' stations, and revised landing gear. The final wartime version, the P-61C, added turbo-supercharged engines for higher altitude performance, though by the time it was ready, the war was nearly over. Still, the legacy of the P-61 wasn't just about combat, it was about what it represented, a completely new way of thinking about air warfare. It combined sensors, firepower, and teamwork into a single platform. It demonstrated that control of the night sky was possible even in the face of darkness, bad weather, and enemy deception. And it laid the groundwork for generations of future night and all-weather fighters that would dominate air combat in the Cold War era. As 1945 unfolded and the Allied forces pressed their advantage across both the European and Pacific theaters, the Northrop P-61 Black Widow found itself increasingly adapting to the evolving demands of war. While initially envisioned purely as a night interceptor, its unique combination of radar, range, firepower, and crew coordination enabled it to take on a broader range of missions, including ground attack, pathfinding, weather reconnaissance, and even psychological operations. In doing so, the Black Widow transitioned from a specialized tool into one of the most versatile multi-role aircraft in late World War II. In the European theater, as the Luftwaffe's nighttime bomber activity declined in the face of Allied air dominance and collapsing logistics, the number of traditional night interception opportunities fell dramatically. But rather than grounding the Black Widow squadrons, commanders began tasking them with more proactive missions. One of the most critical roles that emerged was interdiction. Black Widow crews flew deep into enemy-held territory, using their radar to navigate in complete darkness. Their targets included German train convoys, supply columns, fuel depots, and retreating enemy forces. The P-61's four 20mm cannons, when fired in strafing runs, could decimate trains and vehicles in a single pass. In some missions, radar operators would locate moving targets on the ground by detecting heat or radio emissions, then guide pilots to the area for a surprise attack. Crews often described these runs as eerie and exhilarating. The enemy had no warning, and the only illumination came from tracer rounds and secondary explosions. During the final months of the European campaign, Black Widow squadrons supported Allied ground advances through Belgium and into Germany. Flying ahead of tanks and infantry columns, P-61 crews reported enemy troop movements, performed harassing fire missions to disrupt retreats, and helped protect nighttime resupply routes. With visibility often limited by weather or blackout conditions, the P-61 became the perfect eyes in the sky for commanders on the ground. One notable innovation during this phase was the use of the P-61 in flare ship missions. In support of night operations, particularly river crossings and assaults on fortified towns, P-61s were fitted with parachute flares that could be dropped over battlefields to illuminate the terrain for ground troops or other aircraft. The Black Widow's stability and endurance made it ideal for loitering over target zones, dispensing light at key moments without drawing significant anti-aircraft fire. Meanwhile, in the Pacific theater, the P-61 was heavily involved in what would become some of the bloodiest and most desperate fighting of the war. On Okinawa and later in the Philippines, Japanese forces resorted to increasingly desperate measures: suicide boats, infiltration squads, and kamikaze air attacks. At night, the threat multiplied. Japanese aircraft, often flying low and slowly, would attempt to penetrate Allied defenses in darkness to strike airfields and anchored ships. The Black Widow rose to meet this challenge. On countless occasions, P-61s scrambled at short notice to intercept incoming kamikazes guided by ground radar and their own onboard systems. In many cases, Black Widows would fly combat air patrols in rotating shifts throughout the night, keeping a constant watch over strategic targets. But the danger wasn't just from enemy fighters. Tropical storms, unpredictable weather patterns, and long over-water flights placed enormous strain on aircraft and crews. Navigation errors could easily send a plane hundreds of miles off course in the pitch-black Pacific night. The radar, once again, proved to be a life-saving tool. Not only did it help find enemy targets, it also helped pilots find their way home. As the Pacific campaign advanced to Iwo Jima, Okinawa, and finally the Japanese home islands, the P-61's roles expanded even further. In addition to their combat patrols, Black Widows flew electronic reconnaissance missions, helped coordinate air raids, and conducted early versions of electronic warfare by jamming enemy communications. One lesser-known role played by the P-61 was in psychological operations. Some aircraft were equipped with loudspeakers and recorded messages in Japanese. Flying low over isolated garrisons at night, they would broadcast surrender instructions, updates on the progress of the war, or even emotional appeals to soldiers to lay down their arms. These missions were high risk, but sometimes highly effective, especially on smaller islands where Japanese defenders were cut off and demoralized. As the war drew to a close, another unique opportunity emerged for the Black Widow: weather reconnaissance and storm tracking. While not originally designed for this task, the P-61's radar capabilities made it a powerful tool for tracking typhoons and storm fronts. Some aircraft were stripped of weapons and retrofitted with experimental instruments, then flown into dangerous weather systems to gather critical data for planning military operations. By August 1945, with the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki and Japan's impending surrender, the combat chapter of the Black Widow was closing. But the aircraft had one more historical moment to record: the last confirmed aerial kill of World War II. On the night of August 14th and 15, just hours before Japan's official surrender, a P-61B flown by Lieutenant Robert W. McDonald with radar, operator Lieutenant Bruce K. Layton, intercepted and destroyed a Japanese Nakajima Ki-43 Oscar fighter that was attempting a final raid. The engagement occurred near the Japanese home islands, and the victory, confirmed in squadron logs, became the symbolic final combat action of the war in the air. After the war, the U.S. Army Air Forces began a slow transition away from propeller-driven night fighters as jet technology emerged, but the Black Widow didn't vanish overnight. Instead, it entered a fascinating post-war period of experimentation and repurposing. P-61s were assigned to reconnaissance squadrons and atmospheric research programs. Some were used by the U.S. Weather Bureau in high-altitude studies. One aircraft, designated P-61C-10, was even modified into a high-speed weather research plane and flew missions well into the late 1940s. Other Black Widows were converted into photo reconnaissance platforms under the designation F-15 Reporter. These aircraft had their radar and weapons removed and were equipped with high-resolution cameras for long-range photographic mapping missions. The F-15 Reporter served in limited numbers, but their flights over remote Pacific islands and developing Cold War hotspots helped set the stage for the aerial reconnaissance missions of the 1950s and beyond. Even in these roles, the aircraft's legacy remained intact. Engineers marveled at its rugged airframe, while pilots respected its handling and reliability. Though slower than the new jets being introduced, the Black Widow still held a place of honor among the crews that had depended on it during the war. The military advanced into the jet age. Most remaining P-61s were decommissioned and scrapped. Only a handful survived into the 1950s, and fewer still exist today. Yet among aviation historians and combat veterans, the Black Widow's reputation has only grown. It was never the fastest, never the flashiest, but it filled a role no other. Aircraft could during the most critical years of the global conflict. The P-61 was a fighter in every sense, but it was also a pioneer. It opened the night skies to American air power. It fused human skill with emerging technology, and in doing so, it became one of the most important, if underappreciated, combat aircraft of World War II. When the guns finally fell silent in 1945, the world entered a new era, one marked by the birth of the jet age, the Cold War, and a complete transformation in military doctrine. Yet for those who had flown the P-61 Black Widow, its legacy remained vivid, not just in the history books, but in the skies that still echoed with the memories of its silent patrols. As the war concluded, and the air forces of the world scrambled to adopt the latest jet technology, the Black Widow stood as a symbol of a remarkable transition, a bridge between old and new, between analog and electronic warfare, between heroic instinct and radar-guided precision. The immediate post-war years brought recognition for the P-61's contributions. Although never as celebrated as the P-51 Mustang or the B-17 Flying Fortress, the Black Widow earned deep respect among pilots, engineers, and historians. Its ability to successfully operate in darkness, to detect and destroy enemy aircraft without visual contact, and to perform in various unconventional missions had proven its worth beyond doubt. Among aviators, the aircraft's design remained a subject of admiration. Pilots who had transitioned to early jets often remarked how stable and forgiving the P-61 had been despite its size. Radar operators, some of whom had never flown before being trained on the Black Widow, fondly recalled the moments of teamwork, the pulse of the radar and the cold silence of night, interrupted only by the urgent call to engage. In an era before fly-by-wire and modern electronics, the P-61 offered a deeply human experience, one built on cooperation, intuition, and bravery. As newer, faster night fighters came online, such as the Northrop F-89 Scorpion and later the McDonnell F-101 Voodoo, the P-61 was gradually retired from frontline service. But its impact was already set in motion. The very concept of an all-weather interceptor, a jet fighter capable of operating regardless of time, terrain, or visibility, was pioneered in part by the doctrine forged by Black Widow crews. And more importantly, the radar systems and avionics developed for the P-61 directly influenced the post-war designs that became the backbone of NATO and US air defense throughout the 1950s. Perhaps the most direct successor to the P-61 was the Northrop F-15 Reporter, a photographic reconnaissance version of the Black Widow. While few were built, the F-15 represented an effort to adapt the P-61's exceptional range and stability to peacetime roles. The aircraft flew important photographic mapping missions over Southeast Asia, the Pacific and remote US territories, helping to redraw the post-war world with aerial precision. Meanwhile, a number of P-61s found second lives as testbeds and experimental platforms. Some were used by the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics, NACA, the forerunner of NASA, in early atmospheric research. Others were converted for meteorological roles, flying into Pacific storms to gather data on typhoons. Though these missions received little public attention, they expanded the usefulness of the Black Widow far beyond its original wartime scope. But time, as always, was not kind to large, complex aircraft with limited post-war roles. Most P-61s were scrapped or cannibalized for parts by the early 1950s. Only a few escaped the fate that claimed so many of their siblings. Today, only 4 complete P-61 airframes are known to survive, with just one currently restored to near-flight condition. That aircraft is the P-61C Midnight Madness, housed at the National Air and Space Museum's Udvar-Hazy Center in Virginia. Painstakingly restored by the Mid-Atlantic Air Museum over decades, this aircraft stands as a tribute not just to the engineers who built it, but to the men who flew it. It remains one of the most popular and awe-inspiring exhibits in the museum's collection. Visitors to the exhibit often express surprise at the aircraft's size. The P-61 dwarfs most fighters of its era, its long wingspan and broad fuselage, giving it a physical presence that reflects its technological ambition. On its T2 nose, The radome is smooth and dark, concealing the equipment that once hunted enemy planes in the night. Inside the cockpit, restored gauges and radar scopes tell the story of a time when war was waged by shadows, and life depended on a flickering screen and a calm voice in your ear. In recent decades, the legacy of the P-61 has been rediscovered by historians, modelers, and aviation enthusiasts. Documentaries, books, and even video games have reintroduced the Black Widow to new generations. Pilots' memoirs, once tucked away in footlockers and attics, now form the basis for studies in early airborne radar combat. The aircraft's operational records, once classified, have been declassified and examined to reveal how revolutionary its missions truly were. Yet beyond the statistics and flight logs, the true legacy of the P-61 Black Widow lies in its human story. The crews who flew it were pioneers. They trained in total darkness, learned to trust machines and each other, and ventured alone into enemy skies with only a heartbeat and a radar blip to guide them. Many never returned. But those who did often spoke not of glory or kills, but of quiet pride, pride in having done something difficult, new and necessary. One radar operator, interviewed decades after the war, said it best. "You never really saw the enemy in a P-61. You felt them. You heard your partner's voice say, 'You're lined up, fire now,' and you did. Then the sky went dark again. It was war by touch, by trust." In the grand story of World War II aviation, the P-61 Black Widow may not occupy the marquee spotlight. It didn't win dogfights over London, escort bombers over Berlin, or land on the decks of carriers, but it won the night. It brought light to the darkness. And in doing so, it helped shape the world we live in today, a world where technology and courage often go hand in hand, even in the blackest night. As historians reflect on the innovations of the 1940s, the Black Widow serves as a reminder of what's possible when engineers dare to defy convention, when pilots accept impossible missions, and when darkness becomes just another domain to master. It is a machine of war, yes, but also a symbol of ingenuity, unity, and the quiet resolve of those who work unseen, unheard, and uncelebrated until now.